Last week we looked at a guy by the name of Mephibosheth, who was the son of Jonathan, the grandson of Saul, the ruler, the king over Israel, the first king over Israel. And so as we looked at him, we talked about a number of different things that were true and things that happened. But as we did that, we were mindful of the fact that we just need to be faithful and committed like Mephibosheth was. Now, today we're going to look at a different type of a deal because we're going to look at Esther. Esther is one of those that speaks to us in a lot of different ways. And as she speaks to us, she tells us things that we need to be mindful of and that we need to be aware of. So as we think about that, let's think about this lady and about all that she would teach us in her life and from her life. When we look at her and are mindful of her, Troy, I'm not having any luck at all. When we do that, we just want to be mindful, okay, here we go, of some things about her life. First of all, and look at the person next to you and ask them with this many sermon point outlines, did you happen to bring a sack lunch that you might be willing to share? We want to look at her condition, her call, her character, her choice, her crown, her courage, and her conquest. And as we do those things, and we're going to try to do them fairly quickly this morning, but as we do those things and look at those things, we want to be mindful of all that she would share with us and that we could learn from this lady's life. She is just a figure that shows up, and in a time and a place and an age when that women were considered as nothing. They were less than cattle. They were less than chattel that just had no particular value or no particular purpose other than being objects that a man might commit his desires toward. They just didn't have a place in society. They were not thought of as anything with any particular value at all. And as that's the case, Esther rises up out of that kind of a kingdom, and she teaches us so many things from her life. We're going to start off with her condition. It says in chapter 2, if you have your Bibles and turn to Esther chapter 2, Ahasuerus was the king. He's the ruler. He has followed a guy by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. Most of us recognize perhaps the name of Nebuchadnezzar, the king and the ruler, and all that happened during him. Well, Ahasuerus has followed him and is now the king and is the ruler. And there's a guy in his employ is working in the castle in the king's court by the name of Mordecai. And it says in Esther chapter 2, verse 7, and Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So we find out from this little verse a couple of three things. One, Esther, Hadassah, was a beautiful young girl, just a very pretty young girl. But even as a beautiful young girl, and as somebody that people would look at, Patty and I stopped this morning and grabbed a bite to eat before we came to church, and there was a group of Amish there. And there was a little Amish girl about this tall, and she was in a little white outfit, a little white dress, and she had a little white hat on her head, little blonde curls, cute as a button. That's the kind of thing I think of Esther. She's just a little cutie. Everybody would just say, oh, isn't she cute? I mean, she's so cute. Or she gets a little bit older and say, man, she should be in beauty pageants. She should be in some kind of contest because she's such a pretty young thing. But it also tells us that besides being a beautiful young lady, that her mom and dad had died. We don't know how. Maybe by famine, maybe by war, maybe by disease. We have no idea. But both mom and dad died, apparently when she was very small and very young. And as a child without a family, she was taken in by a guy by the name of Mordecai, who was Esther's uncle's boy. I'm not good in trees. I think that makes them cousins. Is that right? So they're cousins. A cousin takes her in to raise her. Why in the world would her uncle not have taken her in? Why would other uncles not have taken her in? The Jewish people were people by custom had large families, and so there were probably several uncles, several aunts. Why didn't one of them take her in? I don't have any idea. But Mordecai, her cousin, decided to take her in and to raise her like his own daughter. She didn't come from a golden spoon in her mouth type of background. She wasn't born with a silver spoon in her mouth. She didn't have it easy all of her life. She came up through the ranks having it a very tough, very difficult situation. Most people say, you know what, if I'd have just had a better, when I say a better set of parents, I don't mean that your parents could have been better. I just mean a better situation with more money, more stuff, more things. If my parents would have just been better in those regards, I could have been something really special. If my parents would have allowed me to have done this and this and this, I could have accomplished all kinds of stuff. Well, Esther wasn't from that kind of a background. She was an orphan. Nobody had taken her in, except finally a cousin decided to take her in, and Mordecai raised her as his own daughter. He loved her, he cared for her, he watched over her, he protected her, he did all of the things that a father would do for a daughter. He cared about Esther, and so he raises her. That was her condition. I don't know what your condition is. I do know this much about your condition, that you, just like me, started out lost, and if I say lost as a dog, I don't mean to be offensive. I'm just saying that we were lost without hope. But Christ looked at us and accepted us and called us to come to be a part of the family of God. Whether you've accepted that invitation or not, I don't know. But the invitation has been made to you to come and to live in the family of God, as Esther was called and invited to come and to live in Mordecai's house. That was her condition. Now here's her call. It says in verse 8 of chapter 2, "And so it was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Hegai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace in the care of Hegai, the custodian of the women." So here's the deal that's going on in the nation. Our lives sometimes are determined by what's happening nationally. You are, whether you know whatever's happening or not, you right now are being swayed one way or the other. Even by government action, you're going to be somehow dealt with in relationship to the coronavirus. It's on the news. It might be a pandemic. It might be this, might be that. Who knows what it could be? But the things of the government are conflicting in your life and giving some direction. Well, Esther had that situation. Ahasuerus, the king, he had had a party. If you go back to Esther chapter 1, and basically not being crude, but here's what had happened. As he got drunk, he called for his wife Vashti to come and to show her off in front of all of his drunken friends. Now, the language of the text wasn't that he just wanted her to come in for everybody to see how pretty she was. There was a lot more involved in it than that. And Vashti said, "I'm not doing it. I'm the queen. I'm not doing that." And Ahasuerus said, "Well, then you're not the queen. Everything that was yours is taken from you. You're kicked out on the curb, and you're on your own." And she said, "Well, if that's the case, that's all right. I'm going to stand by what's right." And so Vashti was no longer the queen. And so the governors around Ahasuerus said, "You need a new queen." And he said, "Yeah, I do." And so they gathered up all of the beautiful women and brought them in before the king's court for the advisors and even for the king himself to look at and to view. What's happening in our world impacts you. You may not want it to, you may not like for it to be that way, but it has an impact in your life. Esther was impacted by the circumstances of what was going on nationally in her life. So she was brought there, and her call was that she was a part of that. Even though she may not have wanted to be a part of it, she did it anyway because that was the call of society. I can tell you beyond any shadow of a doubt that there's something happening that you do, and hopefully you do thankfully, but with some regret. and it's going to happen in about 6 or 7 weeks. It's something called income tax season. Anybody here aware that you're going to have to do taxes one of these days if you haven't already done it? Anybody here want to say, I'm just so thrilled, I can't wait every year until April 15th gets here. I'm excited about doing taxes. Anybody here like that? No, but the government sways you along that line, and you'll do it because that's what the government says to do. Esther was called up because that's what the king said that was to happen. Now, here's what happens when she gets called up. This is about her character. It says in chapter 2, again picking up in verse 8 and following, it said, now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor. So he readily gave beauty preparations to her, besides her allowance. In other words, when the king saw her, and it's nothing like TV shows that you watch on TV, but when the king saw her, he said, man, she's one of the top 10 contenders. I mean, bring her into the courtyard, give her preparations to help her get beautiful. Now, for you women, I don't know what that means to you. It means give her a facial, give her a new hairdo, give her exercise, work on her diet, do her nails, do all of that stuff. I mean, get her as pretty as you can get her. He did all the beauty preparations, plus he paid her a handsome sum of money, which is the allowance. And he goes on to say in that verse, and then 7 chose maiden servants were provided for her from the king's palace. And he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. So the king said, man, listen, I want her to see what can happen if we take care of her royally. And so he designated or appointed 7 women to take care of her and to help her in her beauty, beautification, beauty treatments, whatever. I mean, she had somebody to do her hair, do her makeup, and do her nails, and do her diet, and do her work, and everything was done for her. And not only that, but he moved her into the very finest place in the palace because he thought she was one of the top contenders in this contest. And it says in verse 20, this is about her character, it says, Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed the commandment of Mordecai as when he was brought up by him. So the thing going for Esther was that she was a Jewish girl. The thing that wasn't going for Esther was that she was a Jewish girl. It was a great privilege to be one of God's chosen, one of God's called. But in Ahasuerus' kingdom, they had made slaves out of Jews. They had slaughtered Jews. They were not a welcomed people within their country. And so she did not reveal that to the king. She didn't reveal it to the king's court. She didn't reveal it to the handmaids that were taking care of her. She didn't tell anybody. Now, I think this is one of the most amazing verses in the Bible. Can you imagine a woman keeping a secret? Not telling anyone? I mean, if people would have been very smart, they would have figured out that she was raised by Mordecai. Mordecai was a Jew. He was a servant, a slave in the king's household. And here she was, his family, his relation. Why wouldn't they think she was a Jew? But she hadn't said anything. She didn't let on. She didn't tell everything she ever thought. She just kept the secret, as Mordecai had told her, listen, you have nothing to be ashamed of. But there are times and there are places when it's wiser and better to be still. In fact, there's a verse I quote to Patty every once in a while out of the New Testament. It says, let your yea be yea and your nay be nay, because whatsoever cometh more than that, from that cometh sin. To me, translated in Jody's translation, this is just hush. I mean, you don't have to talk about everything to the sunsets, just hush. Esther was the kind of gal that could keep her secrets to herself. She didn't say anything. That was her character. She had been called, she had been chosen, she had been selected up to this point in the top 10, as it were, And she's keeping this secret because that's the way she had been brought up. Now we move from the character to her choice. If you drop down to verse 15 in chapter 2, it says, "Now when the turn come for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter to go up into the king." So this is the finals. This is the very final selection of who's going to be the king. She's brought up into the house, and in the palace, apparently, there was this large room, had massive columns, and on the one end it was open. And as you looked out across the openness of this hall, the king sat here and looked out across this open expanse. As he looked out, there was a hall across, we would say the street, there was a hall across the alley or the street, and there also was another hall, and in it people would gather before they would come into the presence of the king. And so Esther was brought into the hall across the street, and she's there, and she prepares to come before the king. And as she makes that preparation, it goes on in verse 15, and it says, "She requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised, and Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her." Now here's the deal. Esther is a pampered, chosen one at this point. The king has already given her 7 handmaidens, has given her the finest accommodations in the palace, has given her a very generous allowance, and said to her basically, listen, anything you want to get prepared for this final selection, you just ask and it's yours. But it says that Esther didn't ask for anything. She just took what was rightfully given and made available to everybody. As Americans, we have, I think, somewhat of a problem in always wanting to have just one leg up on everybody else in most situations. Esther might have said, in today's culture, if you let me have a new sports car, convertible, candy apple red with flake paint job on it, it just sparkles in the sun, and I can ride up before the presence of the king. I don't know what color hair she had, but with my golden hair flowing in the air, the king won't have any choice but to choose me. In reality, she probably said, if you'll give me a good-looking camel, I could ride up in the king's presence. But I don't know how she did it, but she didn't want anything else. She just said, I just take what I've been given, and I'll deal with it the very best that I possibly can. I don't know about you, but is it hard not sometimes to want what other people have? Is it hard not to sometimes have this desire to say, man, if I just had. I look back at my life and my ministry, I think, man, God, I don't know why. Why didn't you make me, through my parents, why didn't you make me take piano lessons? Or at least the guitar lessons, so that I had some kind of musical ability. If I could sing and preach, do you know what I could have done in life? I don't know how I would have played, but I know how it would have sounded, and it wouldn't have helped. But don't we always want something else? Think that God should do something else for us, give us something else? If we just had something else? Esther said, no, I'll just go stand before him just like I am, to be content with who you are. Didn't you like Beth's song this morning? You are not who you say you are. You are who God says you are. That's who you are. You're not who you think you are. You're who God says you are. Say, well, but maybe he doesn't think as highly of me as I think of me. Well, he thinks a lot higher of you than you think of yourself. He doesn't think of you necessarily in the same way that you think of yourself, but he thinks much more highly of you than what you think of yourself. And so he says, listen, I have chosen you, and I want you to be happy with what I've created. All of us have conflicts in life, right? Sometimes it's simple things. Sometimes it's not so simple things. Sometimes something as simple as buying clothes can be a job. Any women here that say amen to that? You say it because you want a certain style, a certain color, a certain cut, a certain. You got a clothing shop. What else do women want? Cheap, on sale. They want that. That type of thing. If it looks okay, it's okay, right? You should have my problems. I have to shop at a place called Big and Tall Men's Shop. I can take you to the Big and Tall Men's Shop anywhere you can find, and I can ask them, do you have something that'll fit me? And they say, oh, sure, no problem. Okay. And we'll go start looking. And they say, I didn't realize you'd take that size. We don't have any of those in stock. Let me see if I could order one of those sizes. They don't have them. I've told Patty for the last 3 years, I just like to get a Carhartt jacket, coat, winter coat. Do you know that Carhartt does not make a coat that will fit me? They don't. They got them big enough to get around me, but when they do, I'm wearing 3/4 length sleeves because I have such long arms. They just don't have anything my size. Now, that's not a big deal unless you want a Carhartt coat, and then it's a big deal. Esther said, hey, listen, I don't want anything special. I just want what I want, what's been given to me. I just want to be thankful for. When I'm in the valley, man, just to realize that, listen, God even here is going to take care of me. God even here is going to bring something better in my life in the days ahead. And so she made her choice. And now here's her crown. The king loved Esther. This is in verse 17. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all of the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So she has been selected as the new queen. Don't you know that was a royal ceremony that day? Don't you know that's a big event? I'm not caught up in, don't care about. I think it's stupid. And anybody that watches it, there's probably some better things you could do with your time. But there's a show on TV called Survivors, right? Well, I don't watch much TV. I don't know. Yeah, there's a show on TV called Survivors. And from the commercials, they brought back the 20 winners of the last 20 contests, those winners, and now they're having a grand finale on who's going to be the winner of the winners. They do it on Jeopardy. They do it on The Price is Right. They do it on all those shows. But they're going to find out the very best. Well, Esther is the very best. She is made queen. She is the queen. It says she's taken Vashti's place. She now is the new queen. She's been chosen. Do you know that God's chosen you? That you're a chosen people, a royal priesthood? That you're something really special in the eyes and in the sight of God? Do you know that God's chosen you for a purpose and for a reason and for a cause? So Esther has her crown. She's now the queen. Man, what a deal. Still hadn't told anybody she's a Jew, but she's the queen. Now, here's her courage. If you jump down to chapter 4, a couple of things have happened. There's a guy by the name of Haman that doesn't like Esther, especially doesn't like Mordecai, and wants to get rid of them and all the people like them. Haman finds out that Mordecai is a Jew. And so he comes before the king. He said, oh, king, listen, I've got a problem that's facing us that you need to deal with, and it's something that's going to be much better for you if you'll take care of this problem. And the problem is something called Jewish people. And we need to have all of the Jewish people either enslaved, but even preferably put to death. We need to get rid of all of the Jews, or at least make them subjects as slaves and the lowest of servants. And the king said, because Haman had said, they're going to destroy your kingdom, they're going to try to rise up and become the king, and they're going to take away from you. And he told him all of these lies. And so Haman had convinced the king to that proclamation. So a proclamation went out that the Jews are to be killed or enslaved. And so as that goes out, Mordecai comes to Esther, and he says to her, listen, cousin, who knows, but for a time such as this, God has called you to this place in life, not just for your sake, but for the sake of everybody. Do you know that God has called up some people to do some things? There was a guy by the name of Noah. Wasn't much of anybody or anything. He's just a man that loved God. God called him to build something called an ark and to save all of mankind and to save all of animal kind. And God chose him, just kind of a nobody. Anybody here know the name Bill Bright? Who he was? He was just a Christian businessman. But Bill Bright was not only a Christian businessman, but he was a soul winner. And one day Bill Bright had gone to a conference, and as they sat there and he listened at the conference, the speaker spoke, and he said, listen, you just need to get things set in order, just to do things, and to do it in a reasonable order, just over and over again. Just keep doing what you do well. Just keep doing it. He said, look, here's Bill Bright sitting right here. He wins more souls than anybody else in this room, I'd say without even question. But you know what I'm going to tell you today? He does it the same way, over and over and over again. He just presents the same word the same way, over and over again. And Bill Bright sat there and he said, I was offended. He said, I invest my life in trying to win people to Christ any way that I possibly can. He said, I went home and started thinking about what he had said. He said, you know, I don't want to admit it, but he's right. I just go through 4 little simple steps to tell people that they're sinners, that they're going to a devil's hell, that they can't do anything, but Christ wants to save them. And Christ will do that by a simple act of faith. That's what I tell them. And so he sat down and started scribbling on a piece of paper, and in a few days he'd come up with a little booklet type of thing called the 4 Spiritual Laws. Now everybody that's your age, just about, has heard of the 4 Spiritual Laws. It was something that was used in soul winning throughout the world, literally, because one man was called of God to stand up, and God used it to see hundreds of thousands and maybe millions of people saved, just because God called one person at a time when it's something special needed to be done. Talk about a preacher, a Presbyterian preacher of all things. But he was a guy from Florida, Presbyterian. Anybody know who I'm talking about? He did something called evangelism explosion. Who am I talking about? No. Who am I talking about? I'm asking because his name just slipped me. I don't know. I thought it'd been smart if you'd have gave me the answer. I said, that's right. That's who it was. But you're not helping me any. But evangelism explosion. And God used this Presbyterian pastor to help train churches around the world how to just go out and to share the gospel. 2 by 2 by 2 by 2, going out and sharing the gospel. And he did that in such a magnificent way. God just calls people. He can even call preachers, but most of the time he just calls people and chooses them. And she had the courage to come before the king now. And in verse 16 it says this. Mordecai says, go and gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, or this is the king speaking, this is Esther speaking. She tells Mordecai, go and gather all of the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day, and my maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and I will perish, and if I perish, I perish. He said, listen, you got to go talk to the king. And Esther says, I don't know. You remember what happened to Vashti? And he said, well, yeah. And he said, but you got to go. And she says, all right, here's the deal. I'll go, but I want you and I want the people around you to pray for 3 days. I want you to pray, fast and pray for 3 days. I'm going to fast and pray because nothing accomplishes more than prayer. And it may be the time, but it needs to be done in prayer. And so everybody agreed, and she went for 3 days praying and fasting. And she came then and said, and if I perish in this endeavor, I'll perish, but I'll go before the king. And it says in chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. This is her conquest. Now it happened on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. Now again, he's back into the king's hall, looking out across the road to the hall next door. Now, there was a whole process and procedure, but if you came to the front of that hall next door and you were ready to walk down those steps and come across the street and up the steps into the king's presence, if you did that without an invitation from the king, they put you to death. It was a sure death sentence, unless the king would take the little baton that he had. It was some kind of a golden thing that was all fancy and figurines and stuff on it. But unless the king took the scepter and held it out to you, and you came into his presence without being invited, you were put to death. And so Esther comes, and she faces the king, and she says, listen, I'm doing this because this is what God has called me to do. And so it was when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. And then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. Now that just means the king has granted her life to be spared. Touching the top of the scepter means I accept the king's deal. God speaks to us and says, listen, you can't come to me. There's no way to come to me except through the gate. And Christ says, I'm the gate. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. But I invite you to come. And if you come, and if you take what I have invited you to, and you accept it, then I'll grant you life. If you don't accept it, you're going to be put to death and cast away into an eternity of a place called condemnation, lake of fire, hell, Sheol, Hades, whatever you want to call it. You're going to be sent there. But she came, and the king accepted her and extended the sepulchre. And the king said to her, what do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you up to half of the kingdom. So listen, Esther, you're a sweetheart. I've spared your life. I've made you my queen. I've given you this interview. And I know, guys, what does he know? When somebody comes, your wife comes smiling and says, hi, honey, how are you today? What do you know? They want something. He knew that she wanted something. And he says, what is it you want? You can ask me for anything you want, up to half of the kingdom. Now, he didn't give away more than half because then she'd been the boss. And so he said, I'll give you up to half the kingdom. What is it that you want? And that's when Esther said, I want you to spare the Jews. I want you to reverse the law and make Jews a people of respect, because they are not here to destroy you. They're here to be faithful servants to you as you're the king of the land. And so he did that, and Haman, although he had planned on hanging the Jews from a gallows and hanging them high, as it says, that Haman is the one that ended up being hanged high, because Esther had stood up and done that thing which was possible for her to do. So when you look at the life of Esther, you see that there are several things about her. There's her condition, her call, her character, her choice, her crown, her courage, her conquest. She did all of those things, and all of that is true of her. And she did it in obedience to God. But then we would ask ourselves the question, so if all of that's true, then what's my consideration? What am I going to learn? How am I going to consider this information, channel it into my life, and make a difference in what I do? And if we'd ask ourselves the question, what is my condition? What is my call? What is my character? What is my choice? What is my crown? What is my courage? And what is my conquest? And I would say this to most of you. You've only made it down through a part of that list. You may only be down to your choice. You may not even think yet that you have received the crown. But God has made you somebody special. And he's made it something very important. We may be down to where we need to think about the courage that's needed to live the kind of life we need to live. Or maybe we have the courage to do that, and we just need to find out now how to be used of God in the way that he wants us to be used. And so we ask ourselves the question, what is my condition, my call, my character, my choice, my crown, my courage, my conquest? What is all of that in my life? Esther did great things, not because she was such a great woman, but because she was a woman that greatly believed in God, and she was going to obey him no matter what. Even from a rocky start and a background that nobody wanted, she stood forth and did what God allowed her to do in her life. I don't know about you, I don't know about all the situations in your life, but I know that Esther is a challenge and an opportunity for all of us.